I'm very excited to have my guest today, Heather MacDonald. Heather MacDonald graduated summa cum laude from Yale with a degree in English. She then earned a master's in English from Cambridge, and she also received a law degree from Stanford. She is a Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. She has won numerous awards for her intellectual work, including the 2005 Bradley Prize for Outstanding Intellectual Achievement. Her writings have also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Republic, and Partisan Review, among others. She's written many books. Her most recent are the national bestselling The War on Cops, How the New Attack on Law and Order Makes Everyone Less Safe, and The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture. So welcome, Heather, and thank you for joining us. It's a great privilege for me because I've been a great admirer of your work and of you, because I think you're very courageous and very heroic to sort of present your message, you know, in the face of threats and all this madness going on. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so let me just say what the purpose today will be. So the purpose today is to get clarity about some of the issues and problems that are plaguing the inner city and what can or should be done to improve it. And so those issues will include crime, policing, and incarceration mainly. And instead of just running through a whole litany of questions, which can be helpful, I think it's better maybe to present somewhat of a context so people know where these questions are coming from if they're not familiar with this point of view. So to that end, I will bring up what I think are very common claims that you'll hear in academia, in the media, in the entertainment industry, and in politics, you know, pertaining to these issues. And then once I give this sort of general claim, I might give a reason for it, and then I'll go into the questions. So we have somewhat of a context that can condition how people understand, you know, what's being talked about. Okay, great. So the first claim that I hear all the time is that the police and criminal justice system are racist. And you actually, I'll read a quick passage from your book, The War on Cops. It's a great book, by the way. And let me read this quick passage here just to show people that this is actually, it's a real phenomenon. You know, I'm not making it up. So you have here, it's at the bottom of page 48, quote, this is you. Speaking at Lehman College in the Bronx, a week after the Baltimore riots, President Obama opined that young Black men experience, quote, being treated differently by law enforcement in stops and in arrests, and in charges and incarcerations. The statistics are clear. Up and down the criminal justice system, there's no dispute, unquote. You go on to write, Hillary Clinton played the same theme at Columbia University several days after the riots. This is Mrs. Clinton speaking, quote, we have come to terms with some hard truths about race and justice in America. There is something profoundly wrong when African-American men are still far more likely to be stopped and searched by police, charged with crimes, and sentenced to longer prison terms than are meted out to their white counterparts, unquote. So this is from two very prominent political figures, obviously, President Obama at the time and Hillary Clinton. And so I've kind of parsed out that paragraph into 3 different points. So the first is that the police are more heavily represented in Black communities, and they harass Blacks under the guise of stop and frisk. And my question for you is this: do the police have a greater presence in the Black inner city community? And if so, why?
Well, they do for 2 reasons. The community of law-abiding bourgeois residents in the inner city community beg for more police presence. People who live with the tyranny of open-air drug markets are desperate to be able to walk on city streets without watching the careful choreography of drug sets. I've never been to a police community meeting in places like Harlem or the South Side of Chicago where I don't hear the good people there beg for more police and for a more concerted and permanent police response. What I hear inevitably is you arrest the dealers, they're back on the corner the next day. Why can't you keep them off the streets? So reason one for possibly more deployment of officers in high crime communities is because that's what people ask for. Reason number two is because they are higher crime communities. Policing today is data driven. This was a revolution that came out of New York City starting in 1994, where the police before the headquarters of the New York Police Department didn't get crime data until 6 months after a crime had occurred. It's a little late at that point to develop effective strategies. So the architects of this revolution that came to be known as CompStat started demanding crime data, victim reports as quickly as possible so that they could get that information back to precinct commanders and develop strategies in real time to try to quell emerging crime patterns. The data that comes into these meetings that are CompStat meetings is race blind. It looks at one thing. Where are people being victimized? Where are people getting robbed? Where are people being shot? Where are elderly citizens frightened to go to the bank to deposit their Social Security check? And that is sadly vastly disproportionately in inner city communities. We have some statistics that even the left cannot claim are biased by police alleged racism, and that is dead bodies. Black males in this country die of homicide at over 8 times the rate of white and Hispanic males combined. That's not the police counting, that is morgues. And the reason that they're dying of homicide at that high rate is because the crime rate in inner city communities is that much higher as well. Black males are being killed overwhelmingly by other Black males. You could take out all police shootings of Black males and you would not change the Black death by homicide rate virtually at all. So the police are there in order to save lives. And let me just add, Mr. Briley, that what we heard from those quotes by President Obama and Hillary Clinton exemplifies the most profound fallacy in the public rhetoric about policing, crime, and race, and that is the benchmark problem. What President Obama and Hillary Clinton did in those statistics is to compare police data like stop rates or arrest rates against population ratios. So they'll say, accurately enough, let's say, look at New York City. Blacks in New York City are about 22% of the population. They make up a little over a majority of police stops, the stop, question, frisk issue. So if you look at that, you say, boy, that's twice as high as the population ratio. Those must be some really racist cops and racist commanders that, out of some irrational prejudice against skin color, are sending cops to inner city neighborhoods and stopping them at higher rates. But the relevant benchmark for police activity is not population, because that's not how deployment decisions are made. It's the incidence of crime. Again, that's what data-driven policing means. It's looking at crime. And if you look at crime in New York City, according to victims of and witnesses to police shootings, not police shootings, excuse me, just drive-by shootings, civilian shootings of other civilians, Blacks commit about 72 to 75% of all shootings in New York City. Now, who are those victims and witnesses? Mostly other Blacks themselves. So that's the data that the police are getting. They don't wish that. They would be really happy to get a report of a white involved in a drive-by shooting. It almost never happens. According to the victims of and witnesses to drive-by shootings in New York City, whites commit less than 2% of all shootings in New York City, even though they're 34% of the population. So if we're going to talk about arrest data, if we're going to talk about stop data, the benchmark to use is crime, commission, and victimization, not population ratios.
Okay, well, thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, you almost never hear that. I never heard that in academia. You almost never hear it in the media. You just never hear it basically anywhere. So I appreciate it. And I guess one more question, a follow-up question to that is, you talked about stop, question, and frisk. Because I hear also that they're in these communities harassing Blacks with this new, I don't know if they're doing it still, but with the stop and frisk procedure. Can you explain what that is? And you actually call it stop, question, and frisk, which I think is a little bit more informative. But can you explain what stop and frisk is, and does it help to reduce crime?
Well, there's no question that being stopped and questioned and possibly frisked in most places in New York, half of the stops that are official stops, this is a particular term of art in the law that I'll talk about, are just, the officer just questions the person, there's not a frisk.
I see.
Being stopped by a cop and asked questions can be at the very least infuriating if you're innocent of any wrongdoing. It can also be terrifying and humiliating. There's no question about that. But it is a lawful power that the police have had since they've had it forever. It was acknowledged by the Supreme Court in 1967 in a case called Terry versus Ohio, that recognized that the police have an intermediate power short of making an arrest. To arrest somebody, you need probable cause to believe that that person has committed a crime. That's a fairly high standard of proof. But the police have something in between simply letting people go by and arresting them, which is to make it's called a custodial stop. It means that the person is not free to walk away. While that stop is occurring, the person has to, at the very least, be present to the officer and be prepared to answer questions. I think you probably maybe have a right not to answer questions, but you can't leave. And that is a test of reasonable suspicion. If the officer has a reasonable suspicion based on observed behavior, what he knows about crime patterns in the neighborhood, he can stop that person, command him to answer a few questions. So let's say there's been, in a particular street, there's been a pattern of car break-ins, and an officer sees somebody walking down the street trying the door handles on a row of parked cars. That would easily rise to the level of reasonable suspicion to stop that person to ask a few questions. To avert a crime. And if the officer feels that talking to somebody or sees it before making the stop that the person has hitched up his waistband as if he has a gun, that would give him reasonable suspicion in order to pat that person down to make sure, to protect his own life and to make sure that the person that he's questioning isn't a risk to other people if he is in fact armed. So this is a lawful power. A former law professor of mine at Stanford University, who is very, very left-wing, has actually said that stop, question, and frisk is the most powerful tool that officers have to deter crime, to deter people from carrying guns. And done properly, it is extremely important and it is effective. Now, the debate has come as to whether there were too many stops that happened in New York City, that there was too much pressure on the cops to keep crime at historically low levels. There's no city in the country that has had as big a crime drop as New York, thanks to us being first and most consistent in this accountable, data-driven policing. This is a highly fraught question. There's some evidence that the number of stops at the absolute peak of our stop rate was higher than actually went on because officers wanted to over-document stops to show that they were being productive. And now I think they are under-documenting stops. They're not actually recording stops. So the drop is probably larger than it was in fact, but it's about a 95% drop in stops from its height in 2011 to today. And the critics of the police will say, well, look at, New York has almost gotten rid of its level of stops, and crime until recently, until this year, was staying low. Now this year it started spiking very, very severely until we had the coronavirus shutdown, which has kept victims off the streets by and large. We still have spiking auto thefts, but violent crime, person-to-person crime is down because the victims aren't out there and people aren't riding the subways. So the argument is that New York has kept crime down without stops, therefore stops are not necessary. And it's a plausible argument. But I would say that New York is sui generis in its experience. Other places that also experienced a very severe drop in stops because of the political vendetta against policing that we saw after 2014, the Black Lives Matter movement, the massive degree of discrediting that went on, and frankly, violence towards cops, hatred towards cops, the behavior they get that James Comey, as FBI director, talked about. When cops would get out of their cars, they would be surrounded by people taunting them, cursing at them, interfering with their lawful authority. Places like Chicago and Baltimore that experienced very steep crime stop drops saw their crime continue to go up. What's happening in New York, my thesis is that now you have informal social controls going on. The way things should work. Policing is not the ideal solution to keep crime down. It's the second best solution. Best thing is people out on the streets, more stable homes, more stable communities. The degree of gentrification that's gone on in many cities, in many parts of New York is massive. You've got African families moving in, Caribbean families moving in that are two-parent families. They're more stable. And that is now working to keep crime down, even without the same degree, we don't know to what extent, but the same degree of stops that were going on several years ago.
Okay, great. So I guess I have just a couple more questions. One is going to be, so we talked about some of the issues there and some of the problems. Well, namely that crime is happening in these communities at a higher rate, which is causing police to sort of flood into these communities. And we also know that, this sort of stop, question, and frisk, more proactive policing does have an effect to keep crime down. So I guess I want to maybe shift now, because we don't have too much time left, shift to what you think our focus should be to reduce crime in these communities. Do you have any thoughts on what you think our focus should be to keep crime down if it's not more police? I mean, you alluded to this a little bit just a second ago, but is there anything more specifically you can say about that?
Well, in the War on Cops, I quote a young crack dealer talking about the fact that he thinks he did well in life because his father saw him occasionally. So he was only a crack dealer, whereas his younger brother, who had a different father, ended up, as they said, a stone cold gangster who robbed people at gunpoint and was even more violent. So this young crack dealer's prescription was having a father around. You can look at the population in the prisons. It is overwhelmingly children, men, boys who have grown up in a community where the marriage norm has almost disappeared. And there is nothing more important, not only to an individual child, but to a community, than having that marriage norm, because it civilizes males. It means that the script is that young males have to learn to restrain their impulses, to defer gratification, to adopt those bourgeois values of future orientation, to make themselves attractive mates. When that norm breaks down and young males can impregnate as many females as they want without any expectation that they should marry the mother of their children, they have no real cause to become a good job prospect or a good marriage prospect. And you have the sort of very anarchic herd behavior that we see with these gangs in inner cities that are engaged in a level of violence that is astounding. I mean, the media prides itself on being so anti-racist and so socially conscious. They turn their eyes away from the mowing down of Black children on a regular basis because they don't care about, I mean, the only explanation I got is they don't care about Black children unless they're shot by a cop. Whereas let some white kid get shot. Look at, Newton, Connecticut, and you have, 24 white kids who were shot, and it becomes a national issue. It changes the entire cultural rhetoric. Well, there's a Newton occurring in the Black community every couple of months, and the media doesn't give a damn. It's sickening. So my prescription would be, don't have children unless you're prepared to marry the father of those children. The best thing a child can have is a mother and a father who are both committed to him, who will spell each other. Having a child is the hardest thing in the world. It's hard enough for two parents, married parents. To be a single mother, there's many single mothers who are working heroically to try to raise law-abiding, self-restrained males, and some are succeeding heroically against the odds. The odds are against them. And you quoted President Obama. We should also quote from his Father's Day speech in Chicago in 2008, when he was running for president, when he had a brief moment of clarity and honesty and gave the statistics about the fate of children on average who were raised without fathers, their rate of incarceration, their rate of poverty, their rate of dropping out of school, their rate of joining gangs, their rate of becoming single mothers themselves, their rate of mental illness. It's off the charts. And he said, we have to be honest about this, that too many boys are not taking responsibility for themselves and their children. Now, changing this means taking on feminism, which has the absurd idea that strong women can do it all. We're living through an era that delegitimates males. There is hatred being directed at males on a regular basis. Masculinity is viewed as per se toxic. So this is a hard thing to change, but that's what I would do. Okay,
great. And I guess for the last question, and I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this, but so that seemed to me to be a community level change that should happen. But do you see any policies that might be particularly helpful at dealing with the crime issue, or would it just be more of this proactive policing, or are there any other maybe policy level strategies that might help?
Yeah, right. For me, personal responsibility, things that individuals can do for themselves, how they lead their lives, what they choose to do, whether they choose to have children out of wedlock, which is a choice. That's the most important thing. We've had a test of policies before 94. The assumption is that homicide just happens. The FBI publishes an annual crime report called the Uniform Crime Reports. and into the 80s rather, it regularly had a disclaimer saying, well, as we all know, there's nothing policing can do to lower homicide. It's a social problem. And the solution was always more government programs, more spending, and that was seen as the way to change things. We have tried that a lot in this country. I know that people on the left side of the political spectrum always think we are not spending enough, but Robert Rector at the Heritage Foundation has summed up the amount we've spent since the war on poverty. It began in the 1960s. It's been trillions of dollars. And I don't think it's done very much to save lives in the inner city. What turned things around in the 90s, we had a 50% drop in our national crime rate when other cities started adopting the proactive policing. Again, policing is the second best solution to crime. The first best solution is communities and families. But until we can get those families back together, I would say that nothing has worked the way proactive policing and predictable incarceration has worked to save tens of thousands of minority lives that would have been lost had the crime rates both in New York City and nationally remained at their early 1990s levels.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been amazing. I think we're just about out of time. So I wish you the best. I'll definitely be following all of your work. And once again, thanks a lot for coming on and taking some questions from me.
I'll be looking for your YouTube channel, Mr. Briley. Good luck and congratulations for starting out in this huge competitive world, but I'm sure you'll be a success. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks a lot. All right.
Thank you.